Welcome to week 2 of Old Testament literature. This week we're going to try to dive into two concepts. The first is going to be what is genre, and the other is going to be what is Hebrew narrative. So when it comes to genre, we're going to try to define it first and talk about ways in which you should think about genre when it comes to engaging the Old Testament. So it's going to overview some literary terms and formats that you'd already be used to from the English language. But you're going to see that when it comes to Old Testament genres, that you probably need to nuance that some. And then when we talk about Hebrew narrative, we're going to talk about what's unique about the way in which the Hebrew Bible was written, in which those narratives become relate to the divine nature of Scripture in a way that other sort of narratives are not written. As in, you should not be reading the Hebrew Bible exactly like you read a novel or any other sort of narrative. There are things that are unique about the Old Testament, the Hebrew narrative structure that helps us to interpret it better. So we're going to engage with the concept of genre with the third chapter in Tremper Longman's The Old Testament as Literature book, which once again is the textbook that we're kind of using as our launching point for this discussion. And ultimately, he's going to argue that genre should signal to the reader how they need to interpret what they're reading. And so he's going to argue, which we'll get to his specific definition at kind of at the end of this section, but he's going to argue when you see the certain characteristics of a certain genre, that should let you know, oh, this is sarcasm, or oh, this is poetry, so I shouldn't take it literally, or oh, this is someone trying to tell me an event, or at least a true event as far as they understand it, so on and so forth. That when you would read something, if you're unsure at some point as you read through it, the genre is going to trigger within you, if you know or are aware of the literature, or you are what's called an implied reader or a competent reader, you'll be able to go, okay, I understand this enough to um, know the ways in which I need to try to interpret this particular text. Tremper Longman's definition is very similar to the one that I have here in front of you, but this is probably my favorite definition of genre, and this is from Janie K. Brown in an article she's written called Genre Criticism in the Bible. And she says genre is a socially defined constellation of typified formal and thematic features in a group of literary works, which authors use in individual ways to accomplish specific communicative purposes. And the reason I like this definition is because it is a constellation. And each culture, each society is going to typify the things that are formal and thematic features that need to be in a literary work in order for it to be a part of a genre. So, one that we have today is like young adult writing. There's certain characteristics to it. There are certain page limits that publishers will put you through. There are certain ways in which you have to write. There's certain vocabulary that you can use and other vocabulary that you normally would avoid. And that's not to say that you can't be on the cutting ends of that. So it's not to say that you can't say, okay, I want to do something young adult and twist the form. But the point is, it's got to look enough like that in order to attract that crowd of people who read those sort of books in order for it to work. Another one would be, like sci-fi. In order for you to write something sci-fi, it has to meet certain characteristics based on our sort of modern standards. And if you don't have those characteristics, they're not going to sell it as a sci-fi book. It's just going to deceive people who are trying to read it. The same thing with suspense, so on and so forth. And so I like this definition because it identifies that there's a sort of constellation and that there is a sense of a social aspect to helping to define which constellations work together and which ones do not. So, one of the things that Longman is going to point out over and over again in his chapter is that in some ways, genre is a modern concept, and we don't need to be reading modern concepts back into the Bible. So, it wouldn't be fair to say, like the examples I just gave, that there's something in the Hebrew Bible that is sci-fi literature, or something in the Hebrew Bible that is young adult literature, or something in the Hebrew Bible that is any sort of modern category that we want to read back into the text. However, every culture has a writing style in order for it to be able to communicate to people who are a part of that culture, people who know how to read or hear things in that culture. And so, even though that's the case, it's still helpful to use our modern categories. We just need to be cautious of employing them too much over the biblical text. And the reason I bring that up is because one great scholar that you'll want to read on the Bible as literature is Leland Ryken. He's got plenty of books and different things, and some that I use, and I even recommend that people would read through in light of studying the literature in the Bible. But I do think in this one case, maybe he goes too far. So let me read this quote here. He says, "The Bible is from start to finish a dramatic book. Up until the modern era, most drama was written in poetic form, and so is the book of Job. In some, the book of Job is a drama, a closet drama, intended to be read rather than acted." So he's going to argue that there's drama in the Bible. So, if you were talking about categories, he would say there's a narrative, there's drama, there's poetry, epic stories, hero stories, a lot of other things. And once again, we've already kind of studied the hero story in last week's lecture. And this week we'll move on to epic. But he's going to say all of these sort of modern categories, Greco-Roman categories of looking at literature, also in some ways exist in the Bible, specifically this one known as drama. However, Todd Linnefeldt is going to disagree with that, and that's why I wanted to kind of get into the section by talking that you don't want to take modern categories and read them back into the Bible. He's going to say instead that there's really two main things that we find in the Bible: narrative and poetry. In drama, a third type of literature is not represented in the Bible. So he's going to say Job is not a drama. Things like nothing in the Hebrew Bible is a drama. I just read, an article about Jeremiah being a drama, and I think Todd Liffett would say that's not true. Jeremiah is not in that category. So I bring that up to say that there is some debate over exactly how we need to characterize each form of narrative and each form of literature. But at the end of the day, you want to start with some sort of title and then try to work out whether that actually fits with the characteristics that you're finding in texts, especially texts that are similar to one another. And forgive me for that. I just had a mosquito go into my ear. So here might be a helpful list to start with, though scholars will go on and on. Is like Longman is going to argue is there's two main types of genre. You can have the prose genre, which is narrative, or the verse genre, which is poetry. Those are somewhat interchangeable. I prefer prose and verse to narrative and poetry because I do think those are subcategories of prose and verse. And so in narrative, you can have hero stories, tragedies, epics, and drama. But I would argue there's another form of narrative in the annals where it's just listing certain things. So you can have nominal and archival annals that just list out information and are not necessarily telling a story, but they're telling you a list, and that list may have some intentionality to how it's ordered, but it's not giving you a story in that sense, and that would still be considered prose. Then you can have verse, and you can have figural verse, which is more poetic, like Psalms, Proverbs, satire, and encomium. And then you can have songs like praise and lament songs, Thanksgiving songs, many other things. So once again, this is just a limited list. But my point would be in both of these, you have kind of further breakdowns that are worth considering. And so this would be a good starting guide. Though, like I said, we'll explore different aspects of each of these as we move forward. So, in light of all of that disagreement that exists within genre studies, especially when it comes to the Old Testament literature. Longman is pretty much going to have a similar view as um, Brown, where he's going to argue that a genre is really just a group of texts that share common features, and they have fuzzy edges and boundaries. And he wants to avoid a sort of strict view of genre and have a more fluid view of genre. However, it's not so fluid that nothing can fit in any category, but so fluid that you can have categories that overlap, and you can have categories that blend, and you can have categories that you don't have all of the characteristics. Um, so, you might have, 7 elements that all fit one sort of genre. And when one element has four, it might be fair to argue that's over 50% of the elements, so it's still in that genre. Or perhaps if those four fit better with another category, to say it's in another one. But the point being is you can still recognize that it has four categories in common with the 7 that you might normally find. And he's going to have, some pushback against Hermann Gunkel, who is the father of source criticism, who's going to say just because all of the forms aren't there doesn't mean the genre has been corrupted or is less pure or has been modified for some mischievous purpose. Instead, it's possible that that's the author intended it that way, and that they're just trying to communicate something to us that's actually going to be helpful and more thought-provoking as we read it, that we don't have to just say it's been corrupted, and so therefore we can't get anything out of it. And so all of that leads, once again, Longman to say, it's just a group of texts that share common features, and each society needs to decide what those common features are. And we can't now impose, once again, what we think narrative should be back on the Hebrew Bible. We need to read the Hebrew Bible over and over again and gather the pieces from what we can see in the text to see how these narratives function together. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. So he uses Psalm 98. And he's going to start off with saying, okay, it's a poem, it's lyric poetry, it's a hymn about a divine warrior, and it's kind of its own unique poem. And then it's also a one group of kingship psalms or royal psalms, however you want to label those, that are in the Psalter. Now, once again, he could have used a narrative here, but the point here being is that there are multiple text, multiple narratives that can fit multiple categories, and it's worth arguing which category is best. However, it's also worth noting that perhaps the author is blending a bunch of categories together, and one of them is not supposed to trump over the other. There is some debate to be had there, but either way, the way you do interpret it is going to relate back to what you think is the main purpose, which is going to relate back to the main reason it was written, which is going to relate back to the format that the author used to write it, i.e., its genre. So here's some of my own research that complements what Longman is doing here. And I have done some research here on Psalm 93, which is normally known as an enthronement psalm. And so this is one of 3 psalms that all begin with the phrase Yahweh Melech, or the Lord reigns, or the Lord is king, however you'd want to translate that. Scholars kind of disagree over that because it's a verbless clause, which I can talk about more in a Hebrew class. And so you've got other psalms that follow that same sort of category. And so what I did is I just compared all of them, because most scholars were saying that they're kind of all in the same category. And what I noticed is that they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements that they share in common. So they all talk about Yahweh's kingship. They all rejoice in Yahweh. They are focused on Yahweh's actions, on his power being described, and they have an emphasis on his holiness. But notice here, as I have in the blanks there, as I say all of them, generally speaking, but Psalm 93 doesn't talk about rejoicing in Yahweh, and Psalm 47 does not talk about Yahweh's holiness. And so the question there that you can ponder is, why is that not the case? Why is there not a section on God's holiness? Why is there not a section in rejoicing in God in Psalm 93? And today my point here is not to answer that question for you, but just to demonstrate how you can go about getting a genre analysis. So overall, they all have at least four of the quote unquote five elements that you might expect to find in an enthronement psalm. So they're close enough together to be in that genre. However, you still would want to think through, why are those other two not containing it? Is there some strategy there? It's worth pondering whether, there are verses missing or something like that if you're looking at textual criticism, if you're looking at textual variants and saying, okay, um, there might be some versions of Psalm 93 that did add a section about Yahweh, rejoicing in Yahweh, and then you have to say, did they add that because they're trying to make it match the genre, or was it there from the beginning, and all kinds of ways to get into that. And so it's worth trying to ponder, is what I'm trying to get at, exactly which genre Psalm 93 belongs to, because it is going to be important for how we interpret it. But it's also worth letting it stand as it is and saying that there's potential that it's supposed to be close enough to this genre where you would recognize that it's an enthronement psalm, but not so close that the author had to follow every element to the T in order for the author to have done that. There could be some creative purpose for why they didn't, which also leads to a theological point, maybe that they're trying to communicate in that particular psalm. So, having gone through that, now we're going to talk about what are the specific elements of Hebrew narrative. And we're not going to have time to discuss all of them. I'm just going to point out some very broad, unique elements, and probably from time to time point out some other ones. So I'm going to try to summarize Longman's view of biblical narrative, which I think is very insightful. But once again, I'll always point you back to the book, the Old Testament as literature, and have you kind of dive into that because he goes into way more depth, gives plenty of examples. So, pretty much, he's going to say that biblical narrative is the selective way in which an author puts a story, and that's the term he likes for events, into a discourse, which is the term he likes for narrative or plot, that has setting and all of that. The whole, I don't want to use the term story, but the whole uh, episode, the whole book into a meaningful sequence. So let's walk through this. So first, it's selective. We have to keep in mind that every story ever told is always selective, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if someone's telling you a story and they say, first the person stood there, then they blinked, then they braved in some air, then they spoke one word, then they spoke a second word and a fifth word, and so on. And then, go back and say, what they said was, they loved me very much. Well, that's not really a good story, right? You'd prefer them to say, he came into the room, he got on his knee, and he said he loved me and wanted to marry me. That's a better story. It's something you want to hear and listen to and go, okay, that's the point. You don't really care necessarily what color shirt was, or how many times he breathed, or how many times he blinked, or whatever it may be. If this is a proposal, you care that they just gave the proposal and what words they said and how they did it and where they were, maybe. But a lot of the other things may not matter unless they're important to how the proposal happened. So similarly, every story is told that way, and the Bible is no different. And most of the times, you don't know what the narratives or what the characters are doing beyond things that are important to helping you understand what God wants us to learn. So then it's an author is going to put a story. Now, what Longman wants to clarify as a story is an event. And for this book, he's trying to leave on the side the question of whether the event actually happened or not. Because when it comes to literature, it's not really important, and I want to say this carefully, it's not really important that the event actually happened. What's important is that the author wants to communicate to you truthfully. So no matter what, if you're reading a narrative and you're trying to give the author the benefit of the doubt, you should assume that the author is trying to say something clearly and truthfully to the audience. The audience can then take that information and say, no, that's a lie. No, I was there. That's not true. And have a debate about it. But in general, unless there's something in the genre, something being triggered, something by the way that they're telling it, there's no reason to doubt that the author's trying to communicate truth. If they're, especially if they're writing this down, they're trying to give you what they think is a valid, honest statement, and then you can decide whether the author is honest or not in and of yourself. Um, just for the sake of saying this, I do think all of the events in the Bible actually happen and that they are verifiable. But I do agree with Longman that it's not important to verify every single event before you can read the Bible and determine whether or not that event is coming to you from an aspect of truth and trying to describe to you something that's important about your faith, life, and salvation when it comes to that particular event. And then that event is put into a discourse or a narrative. Once again, I just would prefer the term story here, but Longman wants to use that differently. It's put into a form of communication, such that you can understand it and try to figure out what the pieces are of that story and where it's trying to go. That's always going to be the case of anything that you read. And so, even though Longman gets into a lot of these, and there's plenty of others, I would argue there are four main sort of principles of biblical narrative, especially when it comes to how this overlaps with the divine mind or aspect of how God is also related to Scripture. So let me read through these. So the first is just going to be a preference for focalization, which is another term for point of view, in the form of third person omniscience. As in, even when is not necessarily called for, you're going to have this third person omniscient voice speaking a lot of the time. So even when it appears to be Moses writing about things that he did, he's still talking about it in third person, like he's not using first person to just describe what happened. It's in third person. Now you could argue, okay, it's not Moses doing that because someone's writing in third person, or you could say Moses is using third person. Either way, the fact that the biblical narrative wants to speak in third person omniscient implies this idea that they believe in an omniscient being behind all of the things that they're describing to you, i.e., God. Then from there, there's always going to be a downplaying of physical characteristics of the character. So you might hear things like, oh, David had beautiful eyes, or that he was handsome, or that Esther found favor in the eyes of all those who saw her, and that she was beautiful. You might hear things like that, but it never gives a description. It never says something like she was beautiful because she had blonde hair and blue eyes, or she was beautiful because she had dark skin and really nice brownish red hair, or that she was beautiful because of the size of her breast. Whatever it is you might want to go to, all of the things that you don't really find in the Bible, generally speaking. Instead, we just told it from time to time, and often you're not told anything about the characters. You're just introduced their name. You're just told, hey, this is Haggai, and Haggai did this, and and those things like in Ezra and Nehemiah, and you're never told, okay, is he tall, short, dark skin, light skin, long hair, short hair. You're never told any of that, and so there's no way to actually know for sure. And the same thing happens with geographical descriptions, that normally you're not really told much about towns or cities or hills or locations. You're just told, okay, David went to this place. This person went to Haran, or they went to the Canaanite village, in the west, or something like that. And it's just kind of downplayed as if that's not extremely important. And to me, both of those play into this idea that things that are happening on this earth, they are important. We need to know where these locations are. We need to know how to get to that. There needs to be commerce. There need to be other things doing, but they're not so important that they should absorb all of our time in the same way that the omniscient being in the first preference should absorb all of our time. And then the last thing is that dialogue is used to explain motives and is exclusively dualistic. So let me break that down into two parts. So dialogue is always used to explain a character's motive. So you can walk through the story, and what the characters say is often going to characterize how they feel, what they want to do, and that's unique in the way in which the Hebrew Bible does it, so that you can expect not to get the sort of inner monologues or in the narrator to actually show up and to tell you exactly how they feel or they're doing. Normally, what they say is going to reveal that what's in their heart is going to be overflowed by what they say. And dialogue is always going to be dualistic, and Longman does a great job of pointing out that often you're going to have just two people talking. You're always just going to have two people talking in dialogue in the Hebrew Bible. Even if it's a group, it's always going to be vocalized as if they're talking collectively, so that it's like a group talking to David and David talking to the group. It's not normally going to be David talking to this one person in the group and then talking to a second person in the group and then talking to a third person in the group, or as if there's 4 or 5 people talking. It's always a sense of a one-on-one conversation, dualistic in the sense it's always two people talking to each other. And that to me, I think, is intentional about the sort of intimacy that we want to find in life and in reality. That it's always a sort of conversation that we're having between us and God and us and how we're interacting with this world. So to me, if you combine all of those things together, these principles or preferences, however you'd want to deal with these, of biblical narrative relate to this idea of how the divine mind, the divine author, correlates to the human mind. They're always speaking as if there's this outer being that exists, such that everything else in our world can be downplayed. Physical characteristics, locations, specific details of events, things like that. And such that you should be focusing on the dialogue, the things in which we say, the things that come out of our hearts are much more important than a lot of our actions. And in fact, most of the time, what we're going to say is going to affect our actions. And that when we talk, we don't just affect, individual peoples, we affect our whole reality. And we affect groups around us, and we affect our relationship with God. And so there's always some sort of intimacy that happens with the nature of how we speak. And to me, that's worth pondering even in just how the biblical narrative starts, right? Because even God begins by speaking the world into existence. So from the very beginning of the Bible, we get this sort of idea that this omniscient being who's going to downplay all of these characteristics and downplay all of these geographical descriptions is also in and of himself speaking in a way that is intimate from the beginning, and we take that aspect on as those who bear his image. So let's really quickly walk through one narrative here in Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. So I'm going to have here now in the days of Ahasuerus, which is a lot of people believe is Xerxes, but in Hebrew his name is Ahasuerus. And then it wants to specify who this Ahasuerus is. So that's your clue right there that there's more than one Ahasuerus because it has to say which one it's talking about. So the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. Now, once again, it doesn't describe those provinces. It doesn't tell you where they are. It tells you roughly it's from India to Ethiopia. And perhaps you could say, okay, well, maybe I need to get an ancient map from the Persian period to figure this out. But the idea here being is those are just kind of somewhat the boundaries that his kingdom does have some sort of boundary. I think that's the most important thing. But inside of those boundaries are all of these different locations in which he rules. And in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his throne in Susa, the capital or the citadel, which is also, ends up being the capital city. And so you can think, okay, sitting on his royal throne, but once again, right here, the throne is not described, right? You don't know how tall the throne is. You don't know how tall Ahasuerus is. You don't know if the throne is way bigger than him, so he looks small in it, or if it's a smaller throne, or you can assume from the word throne that it has a back support, but maybe it didn't have a back support. And once again, archaeology helps us to fill in some of the gaps of what we would expect, but the biblical narrative doesn't do that for us. So, in the third year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. Once again, none of the officials and servants are explained as to what they look like. And, the word feast here means something like a banquet. So we do know some more probably drinking there because it's from the root word that means to drink. than eating. But either way, it's some sort of feast, but you're not given any description beyond that. And then it says the army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. So you can assume, okay, if there's 127 provinces, there's going to be 127 nobles and governors, people who are ruling these provinces, but it doesn't specify once again. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. And notice that of all the things that were said, the emphasis gets placed on here just by all of these descriptors. His royal glory, splendor, pomp, greatness, many days, 180 days. So the idea being that his glory, splendor, pomp, greatness took him, and I guess, I could have circled riches, so forgive me, his riches took him many days to explain. So just like it takes many days, he has many riches. And that's the point that, many provinces, 127 of them, that's the point that the author is trying to emphasize here overall, is that there are this Ahasuerus is at the top of his game, and he's got many riches and glory and splendor and pomp and greatness that he wants to display. And that's kind of the setting up of the story here. All of the other details help to flesh that out. That the fact that he can have this feast and have all of these governors there from these 127 provinces adds to that, but that would be, in a sense, the main emphasis of just the plain narrative here. Now, there are other things that are in the narrative that are also important. And this is kind of where my book on Esther, Literary Allusions in Esther, kind of dives into all of these. But, and I'll just, translate the Hebrew here for you. So, so in Esther chapter 1, verse 2, which we just read a minute ago, is going to say, it was in these days that sat the king Ahasuerus upon his throne. And one of the things you notice in the Hebrew Bible is that to sit upon one's throne is a very rare phrase. It's only used in Deuteronomy to talk about the king, the ideal king that God would have, and then the only two people who are said to do it. In Hebrew, this is Solomon's name, and this is Ahasuerus' name, and you got the same exact phrase here of Solomon and Ahasuerus. And so, even though you're supposed to say, okay, Ahasuerus has all these riches and glory and all of that he's trying to display through what's called intertextuality, which we'll slowly explore, in my lectures, but we'll get to a specific lecture on that at the end of this series. You're also supposed to ponder, okay, he's got all these riches and glory and greatness, just like Solomon. Oh, he's set upon his throne, just like Solomon. Okay, Solomon failed to be God's ideal king. Will Ahasuerus be God's ideal king? That's part of what I think the author of Esther wants us to ponder, and to compare and contrast these two with the description of God's king in Deuteronomy as well. So we'll end this with talking about one of Ryken's categories, the epic. So he's going to say an epic is pretty much a hero story, but on a grand scale. So when you've got more than one hero story placed into sequence, that will form an epic. So he's going to give an example of, like in Genesis, he's going to call that an epic because you got the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and those four patriarchs. All of their stories are combined together and roughly four sections. So therefore, that's going to be an epic of going from Abraham to Joseph. He's going to do the same thing with the Exodus narratives and say, okay, Moses goes through, all of these different events and stories and becomes the central hero story. But, Moses' hero story might be like Exodus 1 or Exodus 2 or just one section of that when he goes against Pharaoh. But he's going to say Moses' epic is all of the different events that Moses does throughout the Pentateuch. And so epics are going to have three main elements: a strong nationalistic interest, so it's focused on what's happening on a national scale. it's always going to have supernatural elements. So it's always going to be something about the other world or being showing up or like a burning bush in Moses' case, things like that that seem supernatural. And it's always going to be stories that are structured in a specific sequence so that you don't always get every single event that the hero went through, but that you get a sequence of events that are leading to a bigger journey or a bigger goal, like entering the promised land or getting the golden scepter or something like that in some form of an epic.